Now then, Charlie Robertson is the Global Chief Economist at Renson's Capital. Is here to help us parse what this all means, plus, of course, a few other things as well. Charlie, after the 2014 annexation of Crimea, you explored the potential impact of Western economies imposing oil and gas embargoes on Russia. How does your assessment then compare to today's scenario?
You prompted me to look back at it, but back then we were looking for Russia to grow about 1.7% in 2014. And we said that if there was a 50% cut in oil imports from Russia, Russia would instead show a decline of about -4.5%, and -2% if it was a 50% fall in natural gas. So we're talking about 100% reduction, probably, by the end of 2022. So even bigger falls this time. And our base case a month ago was -8%. And we said it could be -10% if we saw even deeper cuts, say, on oil. The reason it's not even worse than -10 is because the oil price is so high. So that makes it a little tiny bit less painful than it would otherwise be for Russia, but it's really going to hurt.
So the EU is speaking about, weaning itself off Russian oil by the end of the year. But from the perspective of frontier economies, the ones you cover, Kenya, Ghana, Vietnam, and so on and so forth, does this make any material change, though, to their access to crude in what is already a very tight market?
Well, it shouldn't. What we are likely to see is Russia redirecting that oil. They can't redirect the gas. They just haven't got the pipelines to redirect the gas. But they can redirect the oil to other purchasers. So India, China, and that's already happening. In fact, they're getting something like a $30 discount to the oil price. So the West is now paying, nearly $110 oil. But India and China probably be paying closer to $80 oil, just because it's become more difficult. But it's certainly disruptive. I mean, I was hearing this morning that our Nigeria office were what they're hearing anyway is that oil, Nigeria is struggling to sell its oil, because normally it sells its oil to India and China, but now they're buying Russian oil. So now Nigeria is going to have to start selling its oil probably to the States, possibly to Europe. So there's just a redirection of flow, which is disruptive and keeps prices high for now.
Let me just raise an argument that was raised by someone I believe we both follow on Twitter, Robin Brooks over at IFF, and he pointed out that redirection might not be as easy as it sounds, because if you start imposing limits on insurance for these freighters that move this oil around in bulk, that may make it much, much harder for Russian oil to essentially get to the markets where, to alternative markets, for lack of a better word. How do you see that playing out?
No, it was a question. I mean, I replied to him on Twitter actually about that, because I think, he's right to talk about if you can't use Greek tankers because they're EU and you can't use Greek tankers to ship, that's going to make it complicated. Russia's been using pipelines, so you haven't needed tankers. So if they're going to redirect to India and to China, they're going to need tankers. Are there enough tankers in the world to carry that? And the second question, non-EU tankers. And the second question is, who would insure them? I mean, I imagine the Chinese and the Indians probably would, at the end of the day, insure them. But it's disruptive, and I think that's why we've got oil up at 110 or so.
Indeed. Let's move on to the business of rates. The Fed raising rates by 50 basis points yesterday. Bank of England today coming in with a 100 basis point rise as well. What's the reaction you're seeing among African Eurobonds?
Well, it's hurt, not right at the beginning of the day. I think at the beginning of the day, the markets were quite relieved the Fed didn't hike 75 basis points, that it was only 50. But you're still taking US rates from 0% at the beginning of the year to 2 by the end of July, and probably close to 3 by the end of this year. And that's a big negative. And you've got countries that 10, 15 years ago had HIPC debt reductions, slicing down the debt to very low levels. It's been falling interest rates and a low level of debt, which has been built up over 10 years. That's been a nice decade. This year's not nice. We've got high levels of debt and now rising interest rates. It's a really painful situation, and I think Eurobonds began to price that in again this afternoon, as we saw them take another bit of a beating.
Does that effectively close the door for any refinancing options for a lot of these issuers, Kenya, Ghana, Angola, or does the option to refinance essentially vary from one issuer to another? Because countries like Angola, for example, if you're buttressed by oil revenues that are streaming in now with oil over $100 a barrel, you're in a far better position than, say, Kenya, where fiscal consolidation has been going off the rails for the last 5+ years.
Yeah. No, there's a very different story from country to country. You know that, my base case is that high fertility countries have a tendency to borrow from abroad because they haven't got local savings because of that high fertility rate. And we've seen countries like Angola and Ghana and Kenya all go out and borrow significantly over the last 10 years. The difference with Angola is that they did a lot of pretty harsh fiscal tightening in 2020. And in fact, their government debts plunged from nearly 110, 120% of GDP to something closer to 60%, under 60% this year. In just 2 years, it's halved. So they could refinance. Ghana probably couldn't. Kenya, I suspect, can, but the markets would very much need to see the IMF on board and would love to see a government do more to control the fiscal side after the elections.
Is there a sense of credibility about Kenya's finances? Because authorities have been talking about fiscal consolidation over and over again for years. Then their spending plans don't match that. And the IMF comes along with these very rosy outlooks. But when you actually dig past the data, you look at employment data, you look at income data, the economy is not doing particularly well. So is there a sense of credibility around Kenya's numbers?
I haven't got a great problem with the numbers themselves, but the difficulty we've got with Kenya is the shilling has been quite strong, helped in the last 10 years by borrowing. When you borrow in dollars abroad, bring it into the economy and sell those dollars for shillings to use them in Kenya, it keeps the shilling strong. And when you've borrowed in dollars and your shilling is strong, the dollar debt looks quite cheap. When you can't borrow anymore, well, when it's more difficult, when the shilling starts to depreciate, as we have seen, those external debt numbers start to look worse. The ratios start to look worse. And if the currency did anything like what we've seen in Sri Lanka, where it's collapsed and suddenly the dollar debt looks massive, government debt ratios start to look terrible, like 110, 120% of GDP, actually, at that point, Sri Lanka's bust. Kenya's not there. Kenya's got time to deal with the situation, but it's going to be tough for whoever wins this election.
Indeed. One last thing for you, inflation. Last week, when the IMF put out its regional economic outlook for sub-Saharan Africa, they flagged the fact that inflation is rising. They expect it to average, I believe, 12% across sub-Saharan Africa this year. And the concern that Abebe put out was, look, I'm concerned about people being able to put food on the table. We're seeing food prices rise. Crude is up 40%. How's that changed your outlook on inflation for frontier economies here?
We've got the numbers going up. I was just running through what Yvonne Mahango, our sub-Saharan economist, has been forecasting, and we do have a pickup, say in Kenya, from say 6% to something like 8%. But most of sub-Sahara is fairly self-sufficient on food. They're not the big importers of Russian and Ukrainian wheat that say Egypt is. And the second thing, we put out a report yesterday looking ahead for the next 6 months and saying there's still lots of challenges and it's going to be quite tough. But one of the areas I felt more optimistic about was wheat. The global stocks of wheat are extremely high, and the markets are pricing wheat as if global stocks were very low. And I think that's wrong. It's possible that I'm missing the shortage on fertilizer, the very high cost of fertilizer. It's possible I'm missing the impact that's going to have. But it wouldn't surprise me if wheat prices fell 50% in the next 6 to 12 months, which takes off that food price pressure. So, and we also worry about global recession risk, certainly in the Eurozone and the UK, which hiked 25 today to 1%, but said we're not going to grow in the UK for the next 2 years. And it could be worse than that. So if there's global recession risk, perhaps taking oil prices down, and you've got this wheat stock issue, very high level of stocks, we might see a lessening of this commodity pressure by the end of this year.
Indeed. Thank you for the update. Charlie Robertson, Global Chief Economist at Renaissance Capital, joining us there live from London.